first thing I want to talk about is a few weeks ago, Pokemon Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution dropped on Netflix in the U.S. It was fun for a 1 a.m. Binge fest, and I enjoyed it. But I want to just deep dive a little more into it because I feel like there's a bit of polarization with the film being out among the fan community, right? I would think so.
From what I mean, from my perspective, I've heard two very differing opinions on it so far. So,
just people who have been in this room.
Yeah. Well, no. Yes, people who have been in this room. You and Jack.
Yeah. The people that matter. So, for those that don't know, it is a CGI animated remake of Pokemon the first movie from 1998, released in America in 1999. Now, obviously, I would tell you that this topic has spoilers, but it's almost the same exact movie, and it's been around for 20 years. So if you haven't seen it yet, that's a you problem, not me. But I figured I'd just mention it. Spoilers. Everyone lives at the end. So, yeah, it's almost a shot-for-shot remake of the first movie with maybe like a couple of additional little bits and one major modification that I noticed, but it's basically the same thing throughout. This version does have much more dialogue than the last one, but I think that's just because the English writers wanted to translate more of the Japanese dialogue rather than writing almost a whole new script like they did for the first movie with new American slang. I think at one point in the first movie, if I recall, they mentioned the Minnesota Vikings at some point when they're riding on the ship. I'm like, well, Japan didn't have that. So that's one example. It's a reason.
Vikings.
It's actually a reason why I actually prefer the dialogue from the first movie over this one, even though the original film is less faithful to the Japanese dialogue. It just feels more natural to me compared to some other forms of kids' entertainment. So it just doesn't bother me as much. I just feel more comfortable with it. It's still believable in the fictional world of Pokemon and of these characters, so I just favor one English script over the other, but it doesn't really take me out of the film. The Netflix film still hit all the emotional feels for me, especially at the end with the final battle. So I do still think it's good, and I do recommend it for Netflix as a watch. If you're really just curious about it, I do recommend it because it still hits. Even though it's a slightly different voice cast from the original, a lot of the original players come back. Mostly Dan Green is Mewtwo. And that, to me, was kind of the biggest thing. I didn't know if I was going to enjoy Mewtwo in the same way again, but they got him back, and I appreciated that a lot. There's actually more voice actors that returned to this film than I thought would compared to the first film. I wasn't sure if they'd come back, but they did, because I know that things change companies and stuff like that. There's all kinds of rights and things, but I'm glad that they got people back. I have to ask, though, why was this movie made? It just didn't add any new elements to the story. Am I the only one that feels this way?
You know how I feel about remakes. In general.
Don't do them.
I never understand the point of it.
It was the same story beginning to end with the exception of animation style. Now, two recent Pokemon movies that have come out within the last 3 or 4 years or so, Pokemon I Choose You and Pokemon The Power of Us. They're set in an alternate timeline with a third film on the way, and still they're establishing a brand new continuity for films. There's still the television show, and there's a new movie timeline. And I Choose You is a remake of the first episode. But the difference is they're incorporating Pokemon from the rest of the 7 generations up to the point of initial release in Japan. And the sequel is essentially a whole new film plot entirely, but just also incorporating all new Pokemon. Why am I bringing them up? I Choose You, in particular, adds new information to Ash's story that just wasn't available back when Pokemon first came out. What if instead of Ash beginning his adventure with the 151 Pokemon pool, he was surrounded by 809 different Pokemon out in the world? You know, that informs new information, I think, and it creates a brand new story. And I actually thought that was a really good idea. I was okay with making a new Pokemon beginning with all of the Pokemon involved because it should create a totally new dynamic for Ash and Pikachu and his surroundings. It makes sense to me. You can take the idea further by revisiting legendary Pokemon stories with all of these new Pokemon around you. For example, Lugia from Pokemon 2000 was used for the sequel in the alternate timeline, Pokemon Power of Us. And for Mewtwo's story and his clones especially, you can play with all of the available Pokemon that are out there, and he can have an incredibly diverse army when he's taking on Ash in his personal Coliseum. But they don't do that. They just stick with the pool of 151. And, it's the same as it was 20 years ago. The movie it feels like a wasted opportunity in the regards of establishing new information. It just could have been a great way, even if you wanted to stick with the 3D animation. You have all these Pokemon to use. Why stick with the same pool that we had 20 years ago? It feels like a waste. This leading to my overall point. Why remake a piece of art if you're not adding anything new to the work? For me, it doesn't feel fulfilling. This is the biggest case of copy and paste I think I've ever seen on screen. Don't copy my homework. Just make it look like you did something different. Okay. Pokemon Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution. Now, I understand a company's search for more money, and that's why you remake anything, especially nowadays, because you want to cash in on the franchises that you have. But most remakes or reboots, they'll at least attempt something new, good or bad. They'll attempt something new with the story, or maybe add new insight to the characters, or maybe flesh out more story elements. And it's okay if it's not great if it lands on its face, but at least someone tried and made the attempt. This is why so many stage and film directors will always go back to William Shakespeare's work every so often, either on stage or in film, to reinterpret the story and the characters. My favorite example is Leonardo DiCaprio's Romeo and Juliet. It feels cheesy to set it in the modern day with guns rather than swords.
So good, though.
But I love it.
Unbelievably good.
Because of the attempt and the interpretation, and I feel like it lands for me in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's just so different, but I wish more of the Shakespeare stories were kind of set in modern day. I think Much Ado About Nothing, I think that came out a few years ago with Clark Gregg, Phil Coulson from S.H.I.E.L.D. I think he was involved in that. So some have reinterpreted, but I love the action and adventure of Romeo and Juliet with guns. I just thought that was really clever.
Who directed that? What's his name? Moulin Rouge.
Oh my God. I can't remember.
I'm blanking on his name, but yeah, that's why it's so good.
We have the internet. We can figure it out. We're just too lazy.
Same director as Moulin Rouge.
Yeah.
And I love both of those movies.
Take that as you will. So this movie, it just doesn't feel justified, because older fans like myself, we still hold the first movie in such high regard. Even though for the parents who took us to the movie theater, I'm sure it was incredibly painful, but give and take, right? For the younger audiences, they could easily question where the other 700 and plus Pokemon are in the world. If they're playing the games and they see this movie and they ask brother, sister, mom, and dad, like, where's the other Pokemon that I've been playing for all this time? And they're just not there for almost no reason. I get that alternate continuities are becoming more commonplace among fandoms and media, and I absolutely love that, especially since I've talked about, Crisis on Infinite Earths as an example. Feel free to check out that video in our watch history, by the way. But why not use that concept to the fullest if you're going to do it? I'll pick the original movie from 98 over the remake every time, but I don't regret watching the remake regardless. I give it a 7 out of 10 for still hitting all the emotional feels that I was not expecting to feel at 1 a.m., for still hitting it just as strong as I remember. But it just wasn't original enough at all.
How do you feel about the 3D redesign of the people? That was something I know Jack was very not a big fan of.
No, that's fair. It
specifically,
it didn't bother me.
Yep.
As much. I mean, quite frankly, I think it's jarring anytime you redesign your characters from 2D to 3D.
Of course. especially from an anime world, which Pokemon is kind of loosely, but it's definitely got, obviously got that Japanese illustration style.
Yeah, but I mean, it's honestly just like watching like any anime fighter video game. I mean, Jump Force is a big example. A lot of those characters were designed for 2D pages, and then a lot of them were redesigned, for the 3D models. And it felt, if I compare as an example, Yugimoto in Jump Force compared to Ash Ketchum in Mewtwo Evolution, they feel the same for me in a lot of ways. So it wasn't as jarring for me. It was an adjustment, but it wasn't as jarring. It just felt like watching the games brought to movie form with a script.
So a couple of relative comments. Delafini J, who was asking if we'll play their Dreams game, so I added them. We will do that next week.
Definitely.
I liked the original Pokemon movies, definitely a lot more than the new one, and Detective Pikachu.
I'm a bad Pokemon fan because I haven't actually seen Detective Pikachu yet.
We both need to watch that, and then we can discuss it.
I meant to do a comparison with that and Sonic, and I never got around to it.
Let's do it. Let's. That's our mission.
That's the mission. That's the mission before next week.
Because that's a good comparison. And we saw Sonic together, so. And Wizard Clint says, I hate remakes. All the Disney remakes especially. Most of them are terrible, and you know how I feel about that.
No, definitely. I'm actually I was actually the most excited for Mulan, believe it or not, honestly, because it wasn't a musical, and it really felt like it was going to be a different story, or much more of an attempt at a different story. But sadly, we don't know what's happening with that movie and many other films in theaters right now. Before I forget, I do want to mention that the film gets an extra point going from 6 to 7 for me, because I appreciate the remake movie theme song at the beginning a lot, because I absolutely love the version that plays at the beginning of Pokemon the first movie. I love the hip-hop aspect. Rather than just sticking with the Japanese intro, that they decided to really, if we're going to remake this for an American audience, let's just go all in and build it up just the way that you remember it. So I didn't expect it. It was actually a huge surprise, so that made me very happy as a musician and a dancer. So
nice.
Yeah.